everybody, it's Zazu Siosi, physical therapist, here with your Movement Minute for today. So today we're going to talk a little bit about the hip. And we have our lovely model, Steve the Skeleton, over here to show us a little bit of what the hip actually looks like. So a lot of times when we refer to our hips, we kind of think about these bones right here being kind of like our hip bones. And I hear a lot of people refer to this portion right here as the hip bone. So those actual bones correlate to these bones over here that are actually your pelvic bone. So it's your pelvis. And the pelvis does create half of the hip joint. But your hip joint itself is actually located a little bit lower in the pelvis and pretty deep, and it is a ball and socket joint. That the ball is what we call the femoral head, which you can see right here, and it's attached to this femur bone. So you've got the femur, that's the ball, and what we call the acetabulum, which is basically the pelvic bone that creates the socket. And you should get nice kind of gliding, sliding movements through that hip joint. The hip joint itself is a multiplanar joint, which means that it moves in multiple planes and is similar to the shoulder in the sense that the shoulder is also a ball and socket, but the shoulder has a lot less musculature around it, which makes the shoulder basically the most mobile joint out of our body. And our hip joint, even though it's still a ball and socket and it can move in a lot of different planes like the shoulder, the hip joint is actually the most stable joint in our body. That's because it's surrounded by a lot of really large muscles in the area that really help to provide that stability through that joint and through the pelvis. And so it's really important if you are starting to have some hip problems, so things like hip pain, if your hip is clicking with a certain movement and that is also accompanied by pain, if your hip is kind of snapping or clicking, even if it's not accompanied by pain, it's something that if you want to improve, you can. A lot of times that noise of the snapping or the popping or the clicking in the joint is just an indication that the tendons that run through that joint are not necessarily gliding and sliding or rubbing up against the things that they should normally be rubbing up against to produce whatever type of movement that you're trying to do. So whether it's a squat, whether it's a deadlift, whether it's, going from the floor to getting off of the floor, picking something off the ground, half kneeling, lunging, anything really where your hip has to kind of move through a specific range of motion, your muscles on both the back and the front of the hip, as well as the outside and the inside of the hip, they all have to coordinate with each other. And so you'll find a lot of the actual tendons that are attached to those muscles that help create that pulley system to create that movement are living in and around this hip joint here. And a lot of them have something called bursa, which is basically just like a little shock absorption pad so that the tendon has somewhere to kind of slide and glide. That is a little bit of a different structure than just a straight up bone. Sometimes, because the tendons are not sliding or gliding or moving in the most efficient ways, then you'll get something called bursitis. And so that is basically when the tendon has rubbed up against that bursa, and that bursa doesn't really like the way that it is actually rubbing up against it, and then it will get inflamed. So bursa is the actual structure that, again, is kind of like a landing pad for that tendon, and then the itis is the inflammation. And so bursitis is something that you'll hear a lot when people are having hip pain, but sometimes it's hard to tell if it's bursitis or if it's a tendinitis. So is it the bursa that doesn't like the way the tendon's rubbing up against it? Is it the tendon that is not again, moving in its pattern where it doesn't have any issues, and now it's moving in a different pattern and it doesn't like it. So now you've got a tendinopathy where you have kind of like a chronic inflammatory process happening around that tendon. Tendinitis is, again, inflammation around a certain tendon, and sometimes, not always, but sometimes a audible clicking, popping, snapping type noise at the hip can be a precursor or an indication that things are not moving in their most efficient ways. And so a lot of times we learn how to move in ways that may be easier for us, may be more convenient for us, but for our bodies is not the most efficient. And over time, you can start to basically reinforce movement patterns that, if they're the only thing that you do, can start to get a little bit of different wearing and tearing in different areas, where really what we need to do is we need to kind of retrain and re-coordinate the muscles and the tendons in that area so that they know they can move in a little bit of a different way. Certainly, any audible noises coming from your hip can also be indicators for other types of diagnoses, like labral tears and different types of other hip pathologies that you should definitely get checked out by an orthopedic specialist. But if this is something that you have already gone and gotten checked out and they send you to physical therapy and the usual strengthening and stretching and maybe a little bit of massage is not really doing it, more than likely you're having a motor control problem or a movement problem that you're trying to fix with a strength or range of motion or stretching mobility solution. So you have to make sure that the solution that you're providing is actually the right solution for the right problem. You may not be weak in your hips. You may not be super tight in your hips. Or you may be, and that might not actually be what's causing the problem. So the way, again, that I think about movement patterns is a movement pattern is like a book written in your brain. You can't throw out the book. The book will always be there. But what you can do is you can write a new book. And you can start reading that book a lot more often and picking up that book with a lot more frequency than you did the old book. And so it's about relearning, retraining that new book or that new movement pattern that is going to get you away from those kind of audible noises, if that's something that bothers you, if that's something that you have pain with, if that's something that you want to optimize. So if you have any questions, hit me up, let me know, and I will catch you next time.